September 2009 was surprisingly warm. Even in Maryland, where autumn usually asserted its rights, with a sharp, piercing wind and prematurely fallen leaves, the air remained mild, almost summery. For Kyle Mitchell, an operations analyst with the National Security Agency, these evening walks from the monumental, detachedly cold Fort Meade complex to the commuter train station were his few moments of true solitude. The only time he truly belonged to himself, not Genesis. Genesis, a project whose name sounded like a mockery. It wasn't a creation, but a total takeover. It was a new, experimental system for global monitoring of digital communications, surpassing anything that had come before. Kyle wasn't just a cog in this machine, he was one of its architects, someone who helped fine-tune the algorithms, teaching artificial intelligence to recognize patterns in an ocean of unstructured data. And lately, this work had filled him not with professional pride, but with a quiet, gnawing anxiety. That day, September 14th, the anxiety morphed into something else, a vague but persistent premonition of doom. It hung in the sterile, air-conditioned air of his office, reflected in the overly lingering glances of some colleagues, and lurked between the lines of one report he'd been told to ignore. Kyle was a stickler for detail, a systems guy, but the system he was part of was beginning to malfunction. Not technically, but humanly. He noticed anomalies, tiny, almost invisible discrepancies in the access logs, strange data patterns that had no operational rationale. It was like discovering secret doors in your own house you didn't know were there. At 7:30 p.m., he emerged from the security zone, showing his pass to the guard. His face on the monitor looked tired, with dark shadows under his eyes. He was dressed in his usual nondescript suit, dark gray pants, a plain shirt, and a dark blue windbreaker. A leather briefcase was slung over his shoulder, containing his work laptop and several paper files, which, contrary to regulations, he sometimes took home for work. His route had been honed over the years, straight from the gate, then left, down a quiet alley, past rows of unremarkable administrative buildings, and then through Freedom Park. It was his personal ritual, a way to switch off, to shake off the digital dust of Genesis. The park was small and well-kept, with neat paths, benches, and lanterns that began to glow at dusk. But that evening, the ritual was broken. Instead of following his usual path, Kyle turned toward the only 24-hour coffee shop on his route, Been There. This was uncharacteristic of him. Kyle didn't drink coffee after noon, fearing insomnia. A security camera mounted above the cafe's entrance recorded his approach. He looked preoccupied, his eyes darting around, as if checking to see if he was being followed. Inside, he spent less than a minute at the counter, buying not one, but two large black coffees. He didn't even try the second one, simply taking the cup and leaving. This act would later be closely analyzed. The purchase of a second coffee would become the cornerstone of his theory of possible collusion with an unknown accomplice. But at the time, it was simply a strange, inexplicable action. Leaving the coffee shop, Kyle headed deeper into the park. The dusk was deepening, turning into an early September twilight. The streetlights hadn't yet reached their full power, casting long, distorted shadows. He walked quickly, almost nervously. A camera on one of the buildings at the edge of the park captured his figure in the distance. He raised his hand to his face, as if adjusting his glasses, although he didn't wear them. Then, with a sharp movement, he removed his left glove, a thin, leather one, and stuffed it into the pocket of his windbreaker. This was the last recorded image of Kyle Mitchell. What happened next remains a mystery. He didn't reach the station. He didn't board his usual 7:52 p.m. train. His phone, a specially encrypted device, stopped transmitting once and for all at 7:41 p.m. It wasn't turned off. The battery wasn't removed. The signal simply vanished, as if the device had been instantly destroyed or placed in a shielding chamber. When his wife, Lisa, started calling him after 9 p.m., she only got voicemail. At first, she thought she was working overtime. That happened. Then, she thought about a possible train breakdown. By midnight, her anxiety had turned to panic. At 1 a.m., she called the NSA's security service. Standard procedures began. First, a check for possible hospitalization or arrest for a minor offense. Then, a questioning of colleagues. Everyone claimed to have seen Kyle leaving at a normal time and in a normal mood, tired but not depressed. Security footage was reviewed. The video of him buying 2 coffees and removing his glove was viewed dozens of times. This raised questions, but provided no answers. Freedom Park and the surrounding area were combed the following morning. No signs of a struggle, no abandoned bag, no blood, nothing. Kyle Mitchell, 34, a highly trained analyst with top-secret security clearance, had vanished without a trace on a warm September evening, leaving behind only a series of mysterious actions, 2 undrunk coffees, and a growing wave of rumors. The official version wavered between a voluntary escape and an accident, but for those who knew Kyle, both were equally improbable. He had simply vanished, and his disappearance was as clean and silent as erasing data from a hard drive. Kyle Mitchell's file, which had lain in the FBI's cold case file for nearly 15 years, was a thin, featureless file. Its physical embodiment was a dust-colored cardboard cover on which a stingy machine had printed a number and a name. Mitchell K. It was lost among hundreds of others in rows of metal shelving that stretched into the dimness of a basement storage facility. To the system, it was a closed incident, labeled Suspected Desertion, Unspecified Incident. To the world, it was just another statistic. FBI agent Eliza Reyes wasn't looking for this case. It found her like an old, half-forgotten wound in a change of weather. The trigger was a routine check of an archived database for a related, entirely contemporary cyber fraud case. The name Mitchell popped up on the screen, causing her to freeze for a second, evoking images from her childhood, the smell of her father's office, laughter at the dinner table, and the serious, intelligent face of the man she called Uncle Kyle. Her father, Michael Reyes, a retired FBI agent with 30 years of experience, was the one who brought Kyle Mitchell to the agency as an intern, and then, seeing his exceptional analytical skills, recommended him for a transfer to the NSA. For Michael, Kyle was more than just a colleague. He was a protege, almost an adopted son. Old Reyes experienced his disappearance as a personal tragedy and a professional failure. Until his death, 5 years ago, from complications of lung cancer, he was obsessed with the case. He didn't believe in desertion, didn't believe in chance. They took him out, Lisa, he told her, his only daughter, already a student at the FBI Academy. They found him, and they took him out, and there was nothing I could do. Eliza, who had inherited her father's stubbornness and keen sense of justice, ordered the physical file to be delivered to her office. The room was modern and austere, with a large monitor on the desk and a pinboard. The contrast with the tattered file was striking. The NSA's official story, as laid out in the documents, was impeccably constructed. Kyle Mitchell, stressed by his highly classified work, possibly related to personal financial difficulties, a mortgage on a new home was mentioned, may have made a deal with a hostile intelligence agency. His disappearance was meticulously planned. He took nothing extra, but according to the report, he may have been carrying encrypted storage devices. The purchase of 2 coffees was interpreted as a possible contact with the agent. An accidental death theory was also considered but dismissed due to the lack of a body or any physical evidence. But Eliza, raised on her father's skepticism, saw not the facts, but the gaps between them. She opened her notebook and began jotting down the inconsistencies. And first, motive. She pulled an old photograph from her personal drawer. Her father, Kyle, and her, age 12, on a picnic. Kyle looked at the camera with a gentle smile, his hand on little Eliza's shoulder. He was no hypocrite. Her father, the best profiler in his unit, read people like an open book. He would have smelled a rat. Financial difficulties? She checked. There were none. The mortgage was manageable. The accounts contained savings for their daughter's college. Second, preparation. Deserters, especially with this level of access, usually prepare the groundwork. They withdraw money, forge documents, and plan their route. Kyle did none of this. Moreover, the day before his disappearance, he bought 2 tickets to his 8-year-old daughter's soccer game for the following weekend. What mother, knowing the truth, would believe that someone buying tickets to a game with their daughter is planning an escape? Third, the NSA. Their position was far too convenient. All FBI requests in 2009 were met with polite but firm refusals under the pretext of national security. The case was quickly relegated to the cold case and buried in the archives. It seemed as if someone was eager to forget about Kyle Mitchell. Eliza leaned back in her chair, looking at the board where she'd begun to recreate Kyle's last day. 2 dots, the NSA and the station. Between them, a park and 2 coffees. She picked up Kyle's photo from the file. He looked at her from his ID photo, serious, collected. But in his eyes, if you looked closely, was that very shadow her father had spoken of. Not guilt, fear. She knew that officially reopening the case without new evidence would be career suicide. The NSA didn't like it when people dug into its dirty laundry, but she was Michael Reyes' daughter. She had to try, at least for him, at least for the boy in the photograph who looked at her with a trusting smile. Eliza closed the folder marked closed. For the system, the Kyle Mitchell case was over. For her, it was just beginning. She pulled out her personal laptop. The official investigation was dead, but the unofficial one wasn't. She would do what her father hadn't. She would find the truth. And if they really had taken him out, she would find out who they were. 15 years have passed. Freedom Park has undergone several minor renovations during this time. Some benches have been replaced, the asphalt on the paths has been patched, and the streetlights have been upgraded to energy-saving LEDs. The memory of the man who once disappeared here has faded, dissolved in the routine of daily walks, jogs, and playing with dogs. The Earth, as often happens, has proven a far more effective archivist than any bureaucratic system. These days, at the edge of the park, where the manicured lawn gives way to a wild, slightly overgrown slope leading to the utility area with the transformer vault, new work has begun. A city company is laying new, faster fiber optic cables. The work was dirty, monotonous, and noisy. The mini excavator operator, a young man named Leo, had been mechanically removing the top layers of soil for 3 hours straight, deepening a narrow trench. The sun was blazing. Dust settled on his face and clothes. He longed for a break and some cold water. The machine's buckets sank into the ground with a dull grinding sound, unearthing a layer of dark, damp soil mixed with rocks and roots and tossing it aside. Something glinted in the sun amidst clumps of dirt. Leo, accustomed to finding anything in the earth, from old bottles to rusty cans, at first didn't pay it any mind. But the glint was different, not glassy or iron. It was matte, leathery, but with a metallic sheen. Curiosity got the better of him. He turned off the engine, jumped out of the seat, and walked over to the pile of excavated soil. Genuine leather, cracked, stiff, almost blackened by time and moisture, but still recognizable. Leo bent down and picked it up. It was a holster, old, simple in design, clearly not a police one, but some kind of government issue. The latch was rusty, but it held. He pulled it. With difficulty, with a crunch of damp leather and oxidized metal, the holster opened. Inside, stuck to the damp leather lining, lay an ID card. The plastic was cloudy and scratched, but the lamination, though blistered, was partially intact. The letters National Security Agency were visible through the grime. Below that, a seal, and most importantly, a photograph. A swarthy face, dark hair, cropped short, serious eyes looking straight into the camera. Name, Kyle Mitchell. Leo froze. He'd heard something about this case. It was a local legend, a story told to new recruits. They say some NSA analyst vanished for good. He'd never thought it was true, much less imagined he'd be the one to find the physical evidence. He turned the ID over in his hands. Then his gaze fell on the holster itself, or rather, its interior. Where the leather wasn't dark brown, but almost black, he spotted different stains. They were more brownish, with a rusty, brick-like hue, and had a strange, uneven texture that had seeped into the material. These stains covered the inside of the holster and the edges of the ID, as if it had once been soaked with some kind of liquid, which had then dried and darkened over the past 15 years. Leo wasn't a forensic scientist, but he had watched TV shows, and he knew exactly what it looked like: blood, dried, old blood. He no longer dreamed of a break. The sensation was chilling, ominous. He held in his hands more than just an artifact. He held evidence, perhaps the key to an old, forgotten crime. He carefully placed the holster containing his ID back on the ground as if it were a bomb, pulled out his phone, and snapped a few photos. Then, without touching it with his bare hands, he carefully wrapped the find in a clean paper bag from his lunchbox and called the foreman. An hour later, patrol officers were on the scene, and a forensics car soon arrived. The news found Eliza Reyes quickly. Her informal database query for the last name Mitchell was set to alert her to any activity. When the ID card discovery was entered into the system, she received an automatic alert. She stood at the edge of that same trench, now cordoned off, and watched as forensic technicians in white coveralls carefully sifted the soil. They brought her an evidence bag. Through the clear plastic, she could see the blackened leather of the holster and the ID card with Uncle Kyle's face on it. And she could see those same brown, rusty stains embedded in the material. Her heart sank. This wasn't proof of desertion. This was proof of violence. Proof of what her father had been saying all these years. Kyle hadn't just been eliminated, he'd been murdered. And all these years, his blood, along with his ID, lay in the ground just a few hundred meters from where he was last seen, alive. Freedom Park no longer seemed serene. Every inch of its land now looked like a potential grave. The past, buried beneath layers of soil and time, had cruelly resurfaced, revealing its bloody, silent witness to the world. Eliza Reyes' office had become the command center of an unofficial, now rapidly escalating investigation. A blown-up photo of Kyle Mitchell's ID was pinned to the center of the communications board, its edges outlined in red to highlight the ominous brown stains. Nearby hung a map of Liberty Park, with the discovery site marked, and a timeline of the analyst's last day. The holster and ID were in the crime lab. The preliminary report confirmed what everyone had already seen. The stains were human blood. The blood matched Kyle Mitchell's DNA sample taken from his personnel file. Officially, the body hadn't been found, but the fact of a forced disappearance, or more likely murder, was now documented. The case was officially reopened. Eliza had the mandate and the resources. But the more she dug, the more she realized the ground wasn't the only place where clues were hidden. The most important leads led into the digital jungle, into the very data Kyle was working with. An official inquiry to the NSA about Project Genesis once again hit a dead end. The response was standard. Disclosure of the information would harm national security. But this time, Eliza wasn't alone. Her actions had attracted attention from within. A week after the ID was found, a message from an unknown number arrived on her personal, unregistered phone. "I know about the Mitchell case. Genesis is the key. Be careful. Meet in a public place." The meeting was scheduled at the National Air and Space Museum, near the Skylab module. The contact was an elderly man with a tired face and eyes that betrayed a constant wariness. He introduced himself as Martin Frost, a former colleague of Kyle's who had retired 2 years earlier. "They killed him, Agent Reyes," Frost said without preamble, looking at the model of the space station rather than at her. Kyle wasn't a deserter, he was an idealist, a foolish idealist. He believed the system worked for the good. "Who are they?" Eliza asked quietly. Genesis wasn't just a surveillance program. Frost ignored her question. It was a living organism, and like any organism, it had cancer. Kyle discovered it. He found anomalies in the code, in the access logs. Someone was using Genesis, bypassing all protocols, not to spy on terrorists, to spy on other targets, on us. He looked around nervously. A few days before he disappeared, he was out of his mind. He said he'd found a back door and ghosts in the machine. I thought he was paranoid. He gave it to me. He said, "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." Frost thrust a small, unremarkable metal container into her hand. Inside was an ordinary USB flash drive. I was afraid to touch her all these years, afraid they'd know. Now it's your problem. The flash drive took some fiddling. It was protected by a non-standard, multi-layered encryption. FBI specialists spent several days working on it. When the first barrier fell, Eliza expected to see secret blueprints or intercepted communications. But instead, she saw a simple text file, Watchlist Genesis TXT. Inside was a list, just 7 names. No titles, no mention of agencies, just first and last names. Anyone else would have considered it a waste of time, but Eliza was an FBI agent. She ran the names through the databases. The result made her blood run cold. These weren't foreign agents or terrorists. These were American government employees, but not just any clerks. The deputy chief of the CIA's counterintelligence division, the technology advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior legal advisor to the FBI, the director of acquisitions at the NSA, the undersecretary of state for cyber policy. People from different, often competing departments. No apparent connections between them. Just a list. A list that Kyle Mitchell deemed so important that he hid it as insurance. Eliza leaned back in her chair, trying to comprehend the scale. Kyle hadn't just found a technical vulnerability, he'd found people, a group deeply embedded in the core of American intelligence. Ghosts, as he called them. They were using Genesis as their own personal surveillance tool, perhaps for blackmail, compromising information gathering, or data trading. And Kyle, with his idealism and meticulousness, had become a threat that needed to be eliminated. His murder wasn't personal or random. It was a hygienic procedure, a fix for a glitch in their own carefully guarded system. Now she understood why the NSA had so diligently covered up the matter, admitting that their flagship program had been compromised from within, and that their analyst had been murdered by their own, would have been a scandal capable of destroying trust in the intelligence community for decades. Eliza glanced at the list of names on her monitor. These people, these ghosts, were probably still in place, still had access to the nation's deepest secrets, and one of them, 15 years ago, had given the order or personally pulled the trigger to make Kyle Mitchell disappear. The shadow of Genesis was longer and more terrible than she could have imagined. She had stepped on the tail of the snake that had entwined the entire tree of state power. Eliza's contact board like a death sentence. 7 names, 7 high-ranking government officials. The theory about the ghosts, a covert group using the Genesis system for their own purposes, had evolved from a theoretical hypothesis into a working theory. But the hypothesis needed to be proven, and Eliza began with the simplest thing, checking the backgrounds of each person on the list for the past 15 years. She didn't look for direct connections between them. Instead, she looked for patterns, anomalies, and she found them. The pattern was so eerie and consistent that it sent shivers down her spine. Name number 1, Robert Silver, technology advisor at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, died in 2012, officially listed as an accident, slipped on a wet floor in his garage and hit his head on a concrete ledge, found by his wife. No witnesses, nothing suspicious. Name number 2, Patricia Van Doren, Deputy Chief of the CIA's Counterintelligence Division, died in 2014. The official cause of death was rapidly progressing, an aggressive pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed 3 months before her death. Doctors were amazed at the speed of the disease. Colleagues noted that several weeks before her diagnosis, she appeared depressed and spoke of the need to get some things in order. Name number 3, Arthur Shaw, FBI Senior Counsel. He died in 2016. The official cause of death was a heart attack during a morning jog. He was 52 years old and in perfect health, according to his physician. An autopsy revealed a massive heart attack, but no cause was found. NSA Director of Acquisitions died in 2018. Official cause of death, car accident. His car plunged off a cliff at high speed on a deserted country road. There were no skid marks. An autopsy found no faults with the car. The verdict, he fell asleep at the wheel. Name number 5, Margaret Stone, Undersecretary of State for Cyber Policy, died in 2021. Official cause of death, a tragic fall down the stairs at her country home. She fell 2 stories, breaking her neck. She was alone. Eliza printed out the report and placed it in front of her partner, Agent Carter, a seasoned 45-year veteran. He hissed through his teeth. "That damned list," he stated grimly, 5 out of 7, all dead, and all the result of perfectly staged accidents. Not a single suspicious murder, not a single investigation. "It's not a hit list," Eliza said quietly, looking at the names. "It's a kill list. Kyle didn't just learn of their existence. He must have discovered them when they were already starting to purge their ranks. Perhaps one of them got out of hand, decided to talk, or the ghosts were simply conducting a routine rotation, getting rid of employees who were no longer needed or potentially dangerous. Kyle witnessed this internal mechanism, and for that, he was killed." She walked up to the board and circled the 2 remaining names. "These 2 are still alive, and we need to figure out why." Name number 6, Gregory Ivers, a former CIA analyst and now a private cybersecurity consultant with a successful company. He seemed to have gotten out of the game and was thriving. Name number 7, David Chen, still held the position of Chief of Data Analysis at the NSA. He was the only one on the list who remained in the system and in a key position connected to the Genesis legacy. Ivers might have paid off or made a deal, Carter suggested, and Chen must be one of them, one of the people running this circus. He could have been the one who gave the order to eliminate Kyle. Eliza nodded. The logic was ironclad. The string of accidents was too long and consistent to be a fluke. It was a signature, the signature of a professional, powerful, and ruthless organization that maintained order within its ranks and eliminated threats with surgical precision. They didn't just kill, they erased their tracks, creating a legally impeccable alibi. Every person on this list was a cog in the ghost machine, and when a cog started to creak or threatened to break, it wasn't fixed, it was replaced. And Kyle Mitchell was that curious mechanic who peered inside the working mechanism and realized that some of the cogs were turning the wrong way. For this, he was torn from reality and thrown into the dustbin of history. But now, Eliza had a map, a pattern. She knew the killer's signature, and she knew they had one more unfinished job. 2 of the people on the list were alive, and if the ghosts were still active, they would get them sooner or later. She had to act before them. Gregory Ivers and David Chen weren't just suspects. They were living targets, and the final thread leading to the heart of the shadow that killed Kyle Mitchell. Eliza's office fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft hum of the computer. The air was thick with the realization of the precipice they stood on. 7 names, 5 corpses, classified as accidents, and 2 living ones, likely unaware they were walking on a razor's edge. Gregory Ivers and David Chen. First on the list was Ivers, a former CIA analyst and now a successful and publicly known businessman. He was easier to reach. Eliza sent him a formal request for an interview as part of a routine background check. The response came not from him, but from his lawyer, a polite but firm refusal, citing his client's busy schedule and lack of any information relevant to FBI matters. It was predictable. Then Eliza took a different approach. She and Carter started following him. Ivers lived the life of a wealthy man, an office in a prestigious neighborhood, meetings at expensive restaurants, a gym. But after 3 days of surveillance, Carter noticed something. "We're not the only ones keeping an eye on him," he said, leaning back in the seat of the company car parked a couple of blocks from the fitness club Ivers had entered. "That gray sedan over there, also the 3rd day. Professionals." Eliza felt a cold lump in her chest. The ghosts were already here. They weren't just aware of her investigation. They were ahead of her. They were watching Ivers, waiting for the moment to strike. She made her decision. There was no more hiding. She approached Ivers as he was leaving the gym and showed her ID. His face, tired and sweaty, contorted with a mixture of surprise and fear. "Agent Reyes, FBI, you are in immediate danger. We need to talk now." They retired to a nearby coffee shop. Ivers, initially hostile, quickly broke down. "I knew they'd come sooner or later," he whispered, squeezing his paper cup so tightly that coffee squirted out. "All these years, I've been living like I was on a volcano. After Silver fell in the garage, I realized it was a purge. We were all on Genesis' hook. They forced us to work for them, and then they started getting rid of us. Who are they? Eliza asked. I don't know names. His voice dropped to a whisper. We never met face to face, only encrypted channels, instructions. David Chen, he was our liaison inside the NSA. He passed on orders. I think he's the only one who knows who's at the top. Suddenly, a tow truck screeched to a halt outside the coffee shop, blocking the view. Eliza's heart sank. It was a classic diversionary tactic. We need to leave, now. She grabbed Ivers by the sleeve. They jumped out the back door and rushed toward her car, but it was too late. As they pulled onto the main road, a huge SUV with no license plates abruptly changed lanes in front of them and slammed on the brakes. The impact was perfectly timed. Their car was thrown onto the side of the road, flipped once, and came to a stop. Eliza woke up to the sound of sirens and Carter's voice, pulling her out of a broken window. She escaped with a concussion and cuts, but Ivers wasn't so lucky. He was taken to intensive care with a severe head injury and broken ribs. Doctors gave him 50-50. It was only by a miracle that this accident was averted. The next morning, Eliza was summoned by her division chief, the assistant director of the FBI. His office was spacious, with a view of the city, but the atmosphere was icy. Reyes, what kind of circus are you putting on? He didn't offer her a seat. Unauthorized surveillance, contact with people involved in closed cases, a chase, an accident. The NSA is furious. They want your head on a platter. Sir, Gregory Ivers was a target for assassination. There is a group. I know what you dug up, he interrupted sharply. Mitchell's list, old cases, coincidences. You're treading on very thin ice, agent. Ice that hides a political abyss. This investigation is closed. All materials on the Mitchell case are to be handed over to the NSA. That's an order. Eliza stood, clenching her fists. She understood. They had found her not through a bullet, but through the system. Her boss wasn't a ghost. He was a bureaucrat who saw only one option: plug the hole before the scandal engulfed everyone. Sir, given the assassination attempt on Ivers and an accident, Reyes, he slammed his fist on the table. An accident, and if you value your career, you'll stick to that story. Take a vacation, a long one. Take care of yourself. It was a warning, the last one. She left the office knowing the game of silence was over. The ghosts had shown their power. They could reach anyone, and they were protected not just by a wall of secrecy, but by the full might of the state machine, eager to avoid scandal. But now she knew for sure David Chen was the key. He was inside the NSA. He was the contact, and he was likely the one who gave the order to kill Kyle Mitchell. Getting to him would be 1,000 times harder. He wasn't a target like Ivers. He was the hunter, and now he knew he was the one being hunted. The pressure was mounting like a storm before a hurricane. The official investigation into Mitchell was once again suspended. All materials collected by Eliza, including the ID holster and the decrypted flash drive, were seized and handed over to the NSA under the guise of interagency approval. Eliza was suspended from all operational duties and strongly recommended to take that aforementioned extended leave. She faced dismissal for insubordination and unauthorized activity, but she couldn't back down. She had one last thing they couldn't take: her memories, her rage, and her names. Gregory Ivers never regained consciousness. He remained a silent witness, hooked up to machines in the intensive care unit. David Chen, the head of the NSA's data analysis unit, had become untouchable. Any attempt to approach him would mean instant arrest and the end of his career. And then Eliza decided to go all in. She couldn't get justice through the system because it was compromised, but she could expose the truth. Using her old informal contacts among investigative journalists, she contacted Olivia Ross, a reporter with an impeccable reputation specializing in national security. Their meeting took place in a secluded, inconspicuous park. Eliza gave Olivia not copies of the documents, she didn't have any, but the entire chain of events. Kyle Mitchell's story, the discovery of the ID, the list of names, the string of accidents, the assassination attempt on Ivers, and the central figure in this whole story, David Chen. "Do you understand what you're getting into?" Eliza asked quietly, looking at the journalist's determined face. I understand this is a story that could cost us both our careers, or more, Olivia replied, just as quietly, hiding the recorder. But someone has to. The publication of the article in one of America's largest publications was a bombshell. The article contained no direct accusations, only facts, questions, and inconvenient coincidences. Kyle Mitchell's name appeared on the front pages for the first time in 15 years. A photo of his blood-stained ID card circulated around the world. The story of the Ghosts, a secret group within the intelligence community, became a major topic of discussion. A political storm erupted. Congressional committees demanded hearings. The NSA and FBI were forced to launch internal investigations. Under pressure from the public and legal experts, a formal criminal investigation was opened for obstruction of justice and corruption. David Chen was suspended from his post. He was interrogated for several days, but he was a professional. He denied everything. Yes, he knew Mitchell. No, he didn't know about his personal problems. Yes, he had heard of Genesis, but the project was shut down. No, he didn't know why his colleagues died in accidents. They were tragic coincidences. No evidence was found of his direct involvement in Mitchell's murder or any other crimes. His lawyers tore the charges to shreds. Ultimately, Chen and his several low-level NSA officials caught in the crossfire were dismissed for incompetence. Several careers were ruined. The system, in its attempt to survive, spat out a few cogs, but the key players, those behind the Ghosts, remained in the shadows. No high-profile arrests of senior officials followed. The case was deemed too controversial and politically sensitive for full justice. Eliza Reyes wasn't fired. The case was too high profile, and she became an inconvenient figure. She was transferred to the archives department, away from any operational work. It was a professional exile. A month after the case was closed, she traveled to Maryland. She stood at the edge of Liberty Park, near the spot where Kyle's ID card had been found. Now, there stood a small, unassuming granite slab, a memorial to Kyle Mitchell. His body was never found. She stared at the name and dates carved into the stone. The truth had been established. His name had been cleared, but there was no justice. The killer, or whoever gave the order, walked free. The system that had allowed this to happen had repaired its facade and moved on. Eliza placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the stone. She had done all she could. She had given Kyle his name back. She had shown the country the shadow creeping through the corridors of power. But shadows cannot be imprisoned. They can only be illuminated briefly and forced to retreat. She turned and walked to her car. The battle was lost, but the war for the soul of institutions that her father and Kyle Mitchell had once started went on. And she knew her personal war wasn't over yet. She would wait, search for new evidence. And one day, perhaps, the shadow would falter and the light of justice would truly fall upon her. But not today. Today, there was only the truth, bitter, incomplete, and without the comforting weight of justice on the other side of the scale.